Hello. Please write down the exact time you start this account and the name of the town where you live. It feels strange to be at peace with the present before going back to a past that has been so carefully buried and erased that it only exists now as a scar on the memory of a land that never forgets. We go back to 1907 and the foggy valleys of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia. A small, isolated settlement called Hollow's End was located here, in a valley carved out by time and shadow. It was a place of cold dust and scripture, where people lived on the side of a mountain that gave them as much trouble as it did food. On a cold October night, 37 people walked into the only church in town for a midnight service. The moon was shining down on them. They were never seen again. There is no official record of the event, which locals would later call the silent tithing. There were no death certificates given out. There was no investigation. It was a terrible time in history that was completely and systematically erased from all records. The few people who knew the truth chose to bury it under a vow of complete silence. That night in the Church of the True Word was not just a tragedy. It was a deal, a blood and shadow covenant that left behind an empty building, the smell of ozone, and a terrifying question. Where did the congregation go? We don't start looking into this cold case in 1907. Instead, we start with the work of Dr. Evelyn Reed, a folklorist from Boston University, 50 years later. Reed was traveling through Appalachia in 1958, gathering ghost stories and folk tales from the area for a big book. She found the first thread in a dusty county archive, where it had been misfiled under mining accidents. It was a handwritten report from a Black Ridge Mining Company form dated October 24, 1907. The report said that the people of Hollow's End suddenly and completely left the settlement. It said that the town's church should be torn down right away because it was unstable and could catch fire. The language was sterile and businesslike, but Reed felt that something was very wrong with it. A whole town doesn't just go away overnight. She was curious, so she went to the area, which is now mostly covered by a thick, scary forest. The people who lived there were careful because they were descendants of people who lived in nearby valleys. They called the land where Hollow's End used to be hallowed ground. But they didn't mean it in a religious way. They meant it in a very deep, instinctual way. Their eyes showed a fear that had been passed down through the years, and they told her to stay away. They talked about a curse, a place in the woods where no birds sing, and a charming preacher who promised his followers salvation, but gave them something else instead. Dr. Reed didn't give up. She wrote in her journal, "The people here are not hiding a story. They are guarding a wound. Something happened in Hollow's End that was so traumatic, so unthinkable, that they have all chosen to forget. But the land has not forgotten. The silence here is not empty, it is full. It is a presence. Before we can understand the strange things that happened in 1907, we need to know who Reverend Alistair Blackwood was." Blackwood was not from the mountains. He came to Hollow's End in 1902. He was tall and thin, and his eyes looked like they held the darkness of the coal mines. No one knew where he came from. He said he had come from a faraway city because a vision from God told him to help the lost souls of Appalachia. The people of the town had never heard anything like his preaching before. It was a gospel of fire and brimstone, but it was also woven with older, darker threads. He talked about the Old Testament God, who was jealous and demanding, but he also talked about the mountain as a living thing, an ancient power that needed respect, reverence, and sacrifice. He called it the jaw of God, a place of great power that could either help or hurt them. There was no denying how charming he was. He gave hope to a community that was stuck in a cycle of poverty and hopelessness. The Black Ridge Mining Company, which owned the town, The mine and the general store was thinking about shutting down the operation because the local coal seam was getting thin. People in Hollow's End were in a lot of trouble, and Reverend Blackwood's Church of the True Word became the most important thing in their lives. He was more than just a preacher. People saw him as the ultimate authority, and his words were law. But there was something unsettling about his ministry. He demanded complete loyalty, cut off his congregation from nearby communities, and made them very paranoid about outsiders. People in the area talked about the Church of the True Word's architecture. The congregation built it under Blackwood's strict supervision. It was a harsh, plain structure made of dark stone from a nearby quarry. It looked more like a fortress than a place of worship. It was on a low hill at the edge of town, and its single narrow steeple looked like a finger pointing angrily at the sky. It was strange that it didn't have a graveyard. When asked about this, Blackwood would give a scary answer. "The children of the true word have no need for graves. The mountain is our vessel, and the earth is our eternal embrace. We will not be scattered, but gathered as one." The church's foundation was even stranger. It was built right over the entrance to an old abandoned prospecting tunnel, which was left over from before the main Hollow's End mine was dug. The mining company had already sealed off the tunnel years before Blackwood arrived because it was unsafe. However, the Reverend insisted that this was the only holy ground where their church could stand. He made the sealed entrance part of the church's design by putting the altar right on top of it. He told his followers that they were guarding a powerful place that connected the physical world to the spiritual world. For the miners, who were very religious and superstitious, this explanation made a strange kind of sense. They thought of themselves as protectors of a sacred place. They didn't ask themselves what they were really guarding it from, or what they might be keeping inside without meaning to. In the spring of 1907, a geologist named Arthur Vance was sent to Hollow's End by the Black Ridge Mining Company. He was the one who caused the terrible ending. Vance's job was to look for new coal seams in the area as a last-ditch effort to keep the Hollow's End operation profitable. Vance was a scientist who was practical and didn't believe in the local superstitions. He didn't think of the mountain as a living thing. He thought of it as a bunch of rock layers and mineral deposits. His surveys made him think that there was a rich, untapped seam of high-grade coal deep below the valley. However, getting to it would require a lot of blasting and new tunnels that would go right under the hill where the Church of the True Word stood. The company quickly made plans when they saw a chance to save their business. They made a generous offer to the town. They would buy all the land, including the church, and move everyone to a new, better settlement with modern conveniences. For a lot of the desperate families, it was the answer to their prayers. It was a chance to get away from Hollow's End's poverty and hard times. But to Reverend Blackwood, it was a call to arms. He didn't see the mining company's offer as a chance to make money. He saw it as an invasion of his religion. He said that the ground under the church was holy and could not be touched. He told his church members that leaving the church would break their promise to the mountain and bring down a punishment much worse than poverty. The community was broken up, torn between the hope of a better future and the scary hold of their faith. The fight caused a deep and bitter split in the small community. The company men, led by a miner named Thomas Alley, were on one side and said that accepting the buyout was the only smart thing to do. They could see a future for their kids that didn't involve hard work and the constant threat of a mine collapse. On the other side were Blackwood's loyalists, who saw the company's offer as a test from God, like a snake offering a poisoned apple. Hollow's End became a place where the tension was so strong that it was hard to breathe. People and families stopped talking to each other. Friendships that had been good turned into distrust and hate. Blackwood's increasingly fiery sermons made the faithful see the company men not as neighbors with different opinions, but as traitors and heretics. Reverend Blackwood's sermons became more intense and apocalyptic. He talked about a coming purification, a time when the faithful would be rewarded and the unfaithful would be turned into a tithe to the hill. He started holding services late at night, and his voice echoed through the valley as he spoke out against the modern world and its temptations. He said that the mountain gave him visions of a great darkness that would take over those who turned their backs on him. That's when the symbols began to show up. The doors of the families who backed the company buyout had strange geometric carvings on them that looked like a mix of Old Norse runes and secret alchemical signs. They were warnings, terrifying statements that these families were going to face some terrible punishment. After that, people started to go missing. Daniel, Thomas Alley's oldest son, was the first to go missing. He was 16 years old and one of the most vocal supporters of the move. One night, he went out to check the hunting traps and never came back. A search party found Daniel's pack and rifle near the edge of the woods, but they couldn't find him. Reverend Blackwood addressed the disappearance from his pulpit the following Sunday. He didn't say anything to make him feel better. He said things that made him feel bad. He said that the boy had been taken by the hollow because he didn't believe, which was a warning to anyone who would dare to go against the mountain's will. A week later, an old couple who had already agreed to the company's first offer disappeared from their home. Their front door was wide open. There was a half-eaten meal on the table, and the same strange symbol was carved deeply into the bed frame. Fear, raw and primal, now held Hollow's End in its grip. The county sheriff, who worked for the mining company, did a quick check but didn't find anything. He said that the missing people probably got an early payout and left the valley without telling anyone. But the people who lived there knew better. Men did not do this. A creeping fear of the supernatural took over the community. The faithful held on to Reverend Blackwood even more tightly, thinking he was their only hope. The few company men who were still there were held captive in their own homes, and fear kept them from speaking out. Blackwood was now in full control. The stage was being set for a final, creepy act of love. If you find these forbidden histories as interesting as we do, you might want to sign up for the Sealed Room. We are committed to finding the stories that have been hidden on purpose. The truth about the disappearances in Hollow's End is much worse than just a cold case, and the last service at the Church of the True Word is something that can't be explained. By subscribing, you make sure that these lost voices are heard. One person who was far away said that the mood in Hollow's End in the last weeks of October 1907 was like a slow-motion collapse. The town was dying, but not because of money problems. It was because of a spiritual poison. Reverend Blackwood said that the mountain had talked to him again. It took one last big act of faith to renew their covenant and keep them safe from the evil that was coming from the outside world. He said that on the night of the next full moon, there would be a special midnight service for tithing. It was a command that everyone had to go. He said that something amazing would happen that night. The faithful would be brought to the heart of the mountain and given a place to live forever. The world outside would be cleansed by fire and shadow. This sounded like salvation to the scared and brainwashed crowd. They started to get ready not by packing their things, but by praying and fasting. They sold the few valuable things they had and gave the money to the church. They boarded up their homes, cutting off their last ties to a world they now thought was doomed. The few families who had been against Blackwood now had to make a terrible choice: leave the valley and give up everything they owned, or go to the service and do what the Reverend said. Most of them went, hoping that being there would calm the crazy preacher down and keep their families safe. It was a deadly mistake. Dr. Evelyn Reed found the only known eyewitness account of that terrible night in 1958. It was the private journal of a boy named Samuel Page. In 1907, Samuel was 10 years old. Samuel's parents were very religious and followed Blackwood closely, but he was scared of the thin preacher in the dark church on the hill. Samuel pretended to have a bad stomach ache on the night of the midnight service, just as his parents were about to leave. His mother told him to stay inside and pray because she thought he was too sick to walk. Samuel disobeyed because he was so curious. He snuck out and made his way through the woods to a ridge that looked down on the church. The only record of what happened is what he wrote in his journal years later, when his hand was shaky and he was still traumatized. He saw the 37 men, women, and children in the congregation quietly walk into the stone building. Reverend Blackwood was the last to come in. Then the heavy oak doors were shut, and you could hear a heavy bar being dropped into place to lock them from the inside. For almost an hour, there was no singing or preaching. After that, the church started to make a low, resonant humming sound. Samuel wrote that he felt more than heard the sound. It was a vibration that seemed to go right through the ground and into his bones. At the same time, a strange pale green light began to pulse from the church's narrow windows, casting eerie, dancing shadows across the valley. The air got colder, and the smell of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike, filled the night. Samuel Page's journal entry for that night goes on and on with more and more fear. The humming got louder and the green light got brighter. He said that the ground shook beneath him, not like an earthquake, but like something huge was moving deep inside the earth. He saw the church steeple move, and the stone walls shook off a fine dust. But there was no sound of people, no screams, no cries for help, nothing. Samuel was most bothered by how quiet the church was, which was strange and complete. It was like the 37 people inside were no longer there. He thought it would take another 20 minutes, but the humming and lights stopped as suddenly as they had started. The shaking stopped. Once more, the valley was completely and utterly silent. A thin wisp of greenish smoke or vapor curled up from the top of the steeple and disappeared into the night sky. After that, there was nothing. Samuel stayed hidden on the ridge until the first light of dawn, frozen in a fear he couldn't understand. He never saw the doors of the church open. He didn't see anyone leave. He crept back to his empty house when the sun was fully up. The silence in his house was now the same as the terrifying silence in the church on the hill. There was no one else left. In just one terrifying night, the rest of Hollow's End had been completely and utterly erased from the world. The midnight tithing was done. The next morning, a man named Henderson, who was a foreman at the Black Ridge Mining Company, came to Hollow's End to give the last buyout notices to the few families who were still there. He came across a ghost town. There were empty houses, and some of them had doors wide open. There was a deep and disturbing silence in the air. When he got to the church, his worry turned into fear. The huge oak doors were still locked from the inside. Henderson and his men yelled and banged on the doors, but no one answered. They were finally able to break the bar with a heavy sledgehammer from their wagon. What they found inside was a strange, eerie order. The hymnals were still in their racks, and the pews were empty. There was nothing on the altar except for one strange thing. A piece of dark crystalline rock that hummed with a faint energy and was cold to the touch. There was no sign of the 37 people who had come into the church the night before. There were no bodies, no blood, and no sign of a fight. They were gone without a trace. Henderson, who was a practical man, was confused and scared. He noticed the strange metallic smell in the air and the fine greenish dust that covered everything. His report to the main office was short and full of panic. He knew that a full-scale investigation would put an end to the company's plans for the valley. It would bring reporters, state police, and questions that no one could answer. The company acted quickly and with purpose. The cover-up was both well-planned and evil. The Black Ridge Mining Company knew that the unexplained disappearance of 37 people would make the news and cause a lot of legal problems, keeping their mineral rights tied up for years, if not decades. They took action to completely control the story. They called in the county sheriff, who was already on their payroll. The official story was that Reverend Alistair Blackwood, a charming cult leader, had convinced his followers to leave Hollow's End and follow him to a new Eden in the Wild West. The report from the company foreman was changed to fit this story, saying that he had found the town and church empty, which was in line with a planned move. The few locals who still lived in nearby valleys were already scared and superstitious, so it was easy to scare them into silence. People told them that the devil was behind what happened in Hollow's End, and that talking about it would only bring the same darkness into their own homes. Fear and bribes were used to get people to be quiet. A week after the discovery, a group of company men went to the Church of the True Word in the dark. They poured kerosene on the stone building and lit it on fire. The storm that night caused the official reason to be a lightning strike. The fire burned down the inside, destroying any evidence that might have still been there. The story could be easier to control now that the only physical part of the mystery was gone. The company took Hollow's End off of all its maps. Within a year, nature started to take back the empty houses, and the story of the silent tithing began to fade from history into the realm of a creepy, half-forgotten legend. The secret stayed hidden for 50 years. The only thing that lived on from Hollow's End was a ghost story that adults told to scare kids. There was a town that disappeared and a church that left. But in 1958, Dr. Evelyn Reed didn't believe the simple official story. Her scholarly mind saw a cover-up, but her folklorist's gut told her there was a deeper, darker truth. She spent months in the area, slowly gaining the trust of the older people who lived there. She wrote down their stories, getting rid of the superstitions and keeping only the facts. The magnetic but scary preacher, the fight with the mining company, the people who went missing, the strange lights, and the eerie silence all started to make sense. Her big break came when she found Samuel Page, the boy who had seen what happened from the ridge. He was now an old man living alone in a cabin and was haunted by what he had seen. Samuel had never told anyone about that night. He felt terrible for living. He saw Dr. Reed as a chance to confess and get some kind of forgiveness. Finally, he showed her the journal he had kept secret for 50 years. Dr. Reed found the terrifying key to the mystery in its yellowed, brittle pages. The story of the lights and the humming confirmed the supernatural part, but the fact that the church was built in a certain way made her shiver. Samuel wrote that he had once seen Reverend Blackwood and a few church elders use a winch to lift the huge stone slab that was the altar's base. This revealed a dark, gaping hole below, which was the entrance to the old prospecting tunnel. Dr. Reed's understanding of the event changed from a mass disappearance to something much more evil after reading Samuel Page's journal. The killing was not a killing in the usual way. There was no fighting in the church, just a procession. Reverend Blackwood had not taken his followers to a promised land in the west. Instead, he had taken them deep into the mountain's dark heart. It was a real sacrifice to give the silent tithing. The people in the church, either in a state of religious ecstasy or fear, had willingly walked into the crack under the altar. The humming, the lights, and the shaking ground were not signs of a miracle. They were signs that something old and terrible was waking up because of the offering. Samuel's journal says that Blackwood preached that the tunnel was a throat that would take them into the mountain's embrace, where they would be reborn as something eternal. He thought he was saving them from a world that was dying. Now, Dr. Reed knew why the company was trying so hard to hide the truth. The truth wasn't just that a church was missing. It was that a crazy preacher was leading a mass suicide, or worse, a mass ritual sacrifice on their property. Dr. Reed was determined to find the physical proof now that he had this terrifying new theory. She was able to find the exact spot where the church ruins were, buried under 50 years of forest growth, by using old mining company maps and Samuel's hand-drawn sketch of the valley. She hired a small group of local workers and told them she was doing an archaeological survey. Then she started the hard work of clearing the site. Many people think that the stories on this channel are just made up, but as Dr. Reed found out, some legends are just the shells of truths that have been lost. What she found under the church's ruins would confirm the most horrible things people said about Hollow's End. Before we tell you about her last, scary discovery, please take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what you think really happened to the congregation. Every comment helps bring these forgotten stories to light. The digging was slow and hard. There was a lot of dirt and roots covering the church's foundation. They found it after digging for 2 weeks, the footprint of the old stone church. There were burned wood and pieces of melted glass all over the ground. They found something scary as they cleared the area where the altar would have been. The ground was different here. It was a huge round slab of concrete almost 10 feet across that was poured long after the church fire. It had the official seal of the Black Ridge Mining Company on it and a date from 1908. This was the last part of the cover-up. The company not only burned down the church, but they also came back later to seal the crack for good, burying the secret forever. Dr. Reed was sure she was close to the truth. She told her team to go home because she needed to write down what was going on at the site by herself. She looked at the concrete seal that night by the light of a gas lantern. There was a small hairline crack near the edge that she saw. She felt a faint, cold draft coming up from below when she put her hand over it. It had the same metallic ozone-like smell that the foreman had mentioned in his first report. Her journal entry from that night is full of both academic excitement and real fear. She wrote, "The company sealed the throat, but why? To hide the bodies? Or to make sure that whatever they were fed that night would never be able to get out?" Dr. Evelyn Reed's last journal entries, which were found at her abandoned campsite a week after she went missing, turn into a scary, broken story. She became obsessed with breaking the seal, thinking it was the only way to show what happened. She got a sledgehammer and a pry bar from a town nearby and started the hard work of breaking through the concrete. For 3 days, she hammered at the crack, but the sound of her work was lost in the thick, quiet woods. Her entries get more and more random. She says that the cold draft from the crack is getting stronger and the metallic smell is getting stronger. She starts to hear things like a low humming sound coming from under the stone. This is the same sound that Samuel Page wrote about in his journal. She wrote that at night she had vivid nightmares of a huge, breathing darkness and a mind made of stone and shadow. She thought the mountain itself was watching her, not a person or an animal. Her ability to be objective in school started to fade, and a deep fear took its place. The humming is constant now. It feels alive. I broke through a small section of the concrete. The darkness below is absolute. It is not an empty space. I can feel it, a presence. The story is wrong. Blackwood didn't sacrifice his flock to the mountain. He sacrificed them for the mountain. He was feeding it, and now, after 50 years of hunger, it knows something is near. This entry suggests a terrifying new way of looking at the events. The congregation was not an offering, but food. The last page of Dr. Reed's journal is a single paragraph that looks like it was written in a hurry and in a state of pure terror. The writing is jagged and hard to read. It says, "The opening is wider now. The humming. It sounds like voices, a choir, but the words are not human. I lowered my lantern on a rope. The tunnel walls are not rock. They are covered in a dark, crystalline growth, and it pulses with a faint light. It's alive. Oh God, Samuel was wrong. The company didn't seal this place. They found it already sealed and just put their mark on it. This seal is ancient. Blackwood didn't open it. He found a way to wake it up. He wasn't feeding it, he was joining it. The tithing wasn't an end, it was a transformation. They're still down there, all of them. And they're calling me. The journal ends after this entry. When state police finally got to her campsite, they found it empty because her university had called them. She had set up her tent, stacked her research notes neatly, and left her journal open on her cot. The concrete seal over the crack was broken, and there was a hole just big enough for a person to fit through. There was no sign of Dr. Evelyn Reed. There were no footprints leading away from the camp. There was no sign of a fight. The woman who found out their secret had disappeared into the mountain just like the 37 members of the Church of the True Word did 50 years earlier. When Dr. Evelyn Reed went missing in 1958, it caused a brief stir in the area. The official investigation found that she probably fell into the newly opened mine shaft and that her body could not be found. The state mining authority was brought in. They thought the whole site was geologically unstable, so they permanently sealed the fissure, which seemed to be a repeat of the original cover-up. This time, they buried the church foundation and the cursed tunnel entrance under a man-made hill made of hundreds of tons of rock and soil. The Black Ridge Mining Company, which is now a huge, faceless corporation, said in a statement that it didn't know anything about the events in question and had no connection to the land. This time, the story of Hollow's End was buried under layers of red tape and dirt. As part of the investigation to Reed's research, which included Samuel Page's journal, was taken. In 1962, a fire in the records office destroyed it. The systematic erasure was now done. There were no more primary evidence, first-hand accounts, or official records. The land was all that was left, along with the eerie silence that still hung over it. The disappearance of an academic, like the disappearance of a poor mining community, was not enough to stop the powerful people who wanted this part of history to stay hidden. The secret of the silent tithing was safe again. The land where Hollow's End used to be is now part of a remote, little-visited area of a West Virginia state park. There are no signs or historical markers to show that there was ever a town, a church, or a terrible mystery there. Park officials officially tell hikers not to go into the area because there are mine shafts that aren't on maps, and the ground is unstable. Park rangers tell a different story, though. They talk about weird problems with equipment in that valley. Compasses spin uselessly, GPS devices lose their signal, and batteries die in a matter of minutes. They also talk about the quiet. Rangers who have spent their whole lives in the woods say that the silence in the Hollow's End Valley is strange and dangerous. There is no sound at all. No birds, no insects, no wind in the leaves, and the forest's lively life just stops. Some people who have been through it say they felt like they were being watched by a huge, ancient intelligence that was watching them from below the ground. Some people have even said they heard a faint, low-frequency hum, a sound that seems to come from the ground they are standing on, and a vibration that feels very familiar and unsettling. To those who know the history of the place, it is the sound of the midnight service, which has been going on for more than 100 years. The creepy story of Hollow's End has drawn some paranormal investigators and amateur historians over the years. Most people leave with nothing but a few bad feelings and audio recordings that are full of static. But in 2011, a group of cave explorers found something disturbing while exploring a network of caves 10 miles north of Hollow's End. They found a strange crystal formation deep inside the cave system, in a chamber that was thought to be impossible to reach. It was a dark, greenish-black crystal that looked like it absorbed the light from their headlamps. It was unlike any other rock in the area. There were metal things inside the crystal, like a belt buckle, a lady's locket, the metal buttons from a miner's overalls, and a small silver cross. It was clear that the artifacts were from the early 1900s. The spelunkers told the state university what they had found. A geology professor who looked at their pictures said that the crystalline growth was not a natural geological formation. He said it was something that looked like it was made of rocks, but was really more like living things. A small earthquake, which happens a lot in the area, caused a rockfall that completely blocked the way to the chamber. This happened before a formal expedition could be sent to get the crystal for study. The way to this one piece of physical evidence was once again sealed off in a way that was both convenient and permanent. What was the real nature of Reverend Alistair Blackwood? Was he just a crazy person, a charming cult leader who led his followers to their deaths because he was religiously insane? Or was he something else? A close look at Dr. Reed's recovered notes shows that she was working on a shocking line of research in her last weeks. She had come across references in obscure European folklore texts to echoes of the earth, or whispering stones, which are sentient geological formations that are thought to be deep within the earth. These stories talked about old, non-human intelligences that could talk to and change the minds of people. People said they were hungry for life and consciousness, and they promised eternal life and communion in exchange for their willingness to sacrifice. The symbols that Blackwood used, which Reed had drawn in her notes, were not random. The symbols they found in these old texts were the same as the ones used in rituals to wake up and feed these beings. This made Blackwood look even scarier than before. Maybe he wasn't the cause of the madness, but just the way it got to people. He was a man whose mind was sensitive enough to hear the whispers from deep beneath the earth, a voice that had been waiting in the dark for someone to listen. He became the tool of an ancient being, a high priest for a god of stone and shadow, and his job was to gather a group of people for a terrifying, life-changing communion. This leads us to the most troubling question in the whole Hollow's End case. What happened to Dr. Evelyn Reed and the 37 members of the congregation? If we believe what Dr. Reed wrote in his last journal entry, they weren't killed. The tithing wasn't an end, it was a change. The thing under the church didn't eat their bodies. It ate their minds and personalities, taking them into its own huge, strange awareness. The journal entry about a choir of inhuman voices suggests that the victims became part of the entity itself, their minds joining in a terrifying, never-ending group. They got the immortality that Blackwood promised them, but they lost their humanity in the process. They are the silent crowd, and their voices are now part of the low, resonant hum that still comes from the earth. This theory explains why the crystalline growths in the nearby cave system look and act like living things. Maybe this is how the entity grows. It slowly turns organic matter and inorganic minerals into a physical part of its own body, burying the things it eats as it gets bigger. So, the whole mountain isn't just a big rock. It is a creature that wakes up slowly, and the events of 1907 were just one meal in a life that lasts for millions of years. Dr. Reed wasn't just an investigator who got too close. She was the dessert, an unexpected gift that showed up at the altar long after the main course was over. The story of the church massacre at midnight is more than just a dark part of history that has been forgotten. It is a scary reminder that there are still places in the world, old and remote, where things work according to rules that are much older than ours. The threat of Hollow's End isn't over if the evidence supports the theories. After being fed once, an entity will get hungry again. A recent geological survey of the area adds the last scary piece to this puzzle. The U.S., in 2019, the Geological Survey did a deep Earth imaging scan of the Appalachian Range to look for new natural gas deposits. The scan's data is available to the public, but there is a strange anomaly in the part that shows the old site of Hollow's End. The scan shows a big, unusually dense mass deep down in the valley. Geologists who have looked at the data can't figure out what it's made of because it doesn't fit with any known rock or mineral formation. Even more troubling, sensitive audio sensors used during the survey picked up a faint, rhythmic pulse coming from the center of the mass. The pulse's frequency was recorded as being very low, well below the range of human hearing, but its pattern was complicated and not random. One analyst wrote in an internal memo that the pattern looked too much like the electrical activity of a sleeping person's brain. It looks like the mountain under Hollow's End is still alive. It is dreaming. There is a lot of silence and questions left behind after Hollow's End. People trying to protect corporate interests have systematically and repeatedly buried the truth. It seems like strange and convenient accidents, like lost records, rockfalls, and equipment failures have all worked together to keep the secret safe. What kind of power did Reverend Blackwood really use? Was it a strange geological event, a supernatural being, or the result of mass hysteria in a small, desperate community? What happened to the only person who saw it happen, Samuel Page? Dr. Reed's notes say that he died of a heart attack in 1959, just a few months after she went missing. His little cabin was cleaned out, and no one ever saw his journal again, except for Reed's own transcribed notes, which also disappeared. He was the last person to speak about the terrible things that happened that night, and when he died, the silence was almost complete. The story is a scary warning about how dangerous it is to have blind faith and how dark things can be in our world, both literally and figuratively. The people who went to the Church of the True Word wanted to be saved and live forever, and in a strange way, they may have found it. They will always be a part of the hollow, their whispers carried on the cold draft from the crack, and their memory will live on in the wood's predatory silence. The worst thing about the Midnight Church Massacre is that it keeps happening. If the entity exists, it is patient. It works on a geological timescale, where a human century is just a brief moment. The people and groups that wanted to hide the event, the Black Ridge Mining Company, and the authorities who helped them, are all long gone. Their secrets are now only known by archives and fading memories. But the mountain is still there. The quiet stays, and the hunger is probably still there. A new, charismatic preacher may not be the biggest threat today. Instead, it may be our own curiosity and technology. What will happen when the next geological survey uses more sensitive equipment to look more closely at the strange thing under Hollow's End? If a new mining company that needs resources decides to ignore the old warnings and blast its way into the heart of the mountain, what will happen? The story from 1907 shows that waking up this dormant power has terrible effects. In a strange way, the cover-up may have been a desperate act of quarantine, a way for scared men to lock away a horror they couldn't understand. Maybe they knew that some doors can never be closed again once they are opened. Now we need to know how long that door can stay closed, and what will happen when the mind that is dreaming under the mountain finally wakes up. Hollow's End's silence isn't a lack of sound. It's a warning that needs to be broken. The story of Hollow's End has changed over time in the towns and villages that are still near the state park. The younger generations only know it as a vague ghost story about the church that disappeared and is now a place that hikers are told to stay away from. But for very old people, like those whose grandparents were alive in 1907, a different kind of memory lives on. It lives on in bits and pieces of sayings and superstitions. People say not to listen too closely to the quiet in the woods, or it might start talking back. If you see a stone that looks like it's sweating in the summer heat, they say you should walk away and never come back. The most chilling thing is that there is a local tradition about a certain kind of wildflower, a pale, almost glowing green orchid that only grows in the soil of the valley where Hollow's End used to be. The name, Preacher's Blossom, comes from the fact that these flowers first grew in the spring of 1908 from the ashes of the burned-down church. People say that each flower stands for a soul that was given to the mountain. People think that gathering them is very bad. One story says that a teenager in the 1940s picked a bunch of orchids for his girlfriend. That night, he had nightmares about a choir singing in a language that sounded like grinding stone. When he woke up the next morning, the flowers had turned into a fine greenish dust. For the rest of his life, he heard a faint humming that no one else could hear. The folklore is a living proof, a cultural scar left by a trauma so deep that it has become part of the land itself. There is one last, unverified story about the Hollow's End case that adds to the creepy mystery. A letter came to the Boston University Department of Folklore in 1960, 2 years after Dr. Reed went missing. There was no return address on the letter, and it was sent from a small town in rural Ohio. It was addressed to the head of the department. The letter didn't have a name on it, but the person who wrote it said they were one of the workers Evelyn Reed had hired to dig up the church site for the first time. The man said in his letter that he was very religious, and that the place made him feel unholy. He said that on the last day, after Dr. Reed had sent them home, he forgot his coat and went back a few hours later to get it. When he got there, he saw that Dr. Reed wasn't digging up the concrete seal. Instead, she was standing still next to it with her head tilted, as if she were listening to something. He said that she was talking to herself in a strange way, mixing academic analysis with what sounded like prayer. He saw her kneel down and put her ear right against the concrete slab as he watched from the trees. After a while, she stood up, and her face changed to what he called terrible understanding. She then turned around and walked calmly to the open fissure, where she lowered herself into the darkness without thinking twice. He said he was so scared that he ran away and never talked about it again until he wrote the letter. If this account is true, it makes Dr. Reed's last moments even more disturbing. He wasn't a victim of an attack. He was a convert, the last member of the silent congregation. The idea of a genius loci, or the spirit of a place, is very old. But in the case of Hollow's End, this idea seems to become terrifyingly real. The thing, the mountain, the whispering stone, or whatever it is, seems to have a psychic territory or sphere of influence. The pattern in history is always the same. People who enter its domain with an open, questioning, or vulnerable mind are open to its influence. Reverend Blackwood, a man looking for a connection with God, became its prophet. The congregation, which was desperate for salvation, became its food. Dr. Evelyn Reed, who was looking for academic truth, was the last person to be affected by it. The influence seems to be subtle at first, manifesting as obsession, paranoia, or an uncanny sense of being watched. It then progresses, as suggested in Reed's journal, to auditory hallucinations, the humming, the voices, and finally, to a complete psychological breakdown, a surrender of one's will to the entity's own. This suggests that the greatest danger of Hollow's End is not physical, but mental and spiritual. The true horror is not that something will crawl out of the fissure, but that it will whisper its way into your mind, convincing you that walking into the darkness is not an act of death, but of ascension. The silence it guards is not to keep people out, but to make its own voice the only one you can hear. This may be why the pact of silence among the original locals was so absolute. It was a form of psychic self-defense, a refusal to even think about the place, lest the place begin to think about you. One question that has never been resolved is the origin of Reverend Alistair Blackwood. Dr. Reed's research didn't find any records of him before he came to West Virginia. He looked like he had come out of nowhere, like a man with no past. But a few online researchers who look into the Hollow's End case have come up with the speculative theory. They talk about a number of people who went missing in the late 1800s in a remote mining area of the German Black Forest, which is known for its stories about creatures that live underground. In 1895, a small, isolated religious commune there disappeared in a way that was eerily similar to Hollow's End. There was an empty church, an abandoned settlement, and no sign of the people who lived there. Alistair Schwartz, a charismatic German preacher, was in charge of that commune. His name means Alistair Blackwood. There has never been a clear link, but the similarities are shocking. Could Blackwood have been the sole survivor, or even the mastermind behind a comparable incident in Europe? Was he a wandering priest of this dark faith, going from one spiritually weak, geologically active place to another in search of new altars and new flocks to offer? If so, the Hollow's End massacre was not an isolated event, but just one part of a long and terrible ministry by a man who worshipped a God that was much older and darker than any in the Bible. It also makes you wonder, if he was part of a bigger tradition, are there other throats in the world? And are there other shepherds still leading their flocks to a quiet, underground salvation? The story of the Black Ridge Mining Company also makes me think of something else that bothers me. Even though their actions seemed to be motivated by a practical need to protect their financial interests, they were carried out with a chilling level of efficiency. They knew exactly what to do, how to make up a story, how to keep a whole area quiet, and most importantly, how to close the gap. The speed and accuracy of their response make it seem like they have dealt with something like this before. Some researchers have come up with a dark theory, that over the centuries that mining and extraction companies have been digging deep into the earth, they have sometimes come across these whispering stones or something like them. Maybe there is an unspoken, unwritten rule among these industries for how to handle such discoveries, a corporate men in black that is in charge of keeping geological and paranormal threats that could disrupt their work under wraps. The concrete seal with the company logo on it might not have been just a way to hide something. It might have been a normal way to keep something in check. This would mean that Hollow's End is not the only story like this. It's just one of the few times the secret almost got out. It changes the way people see the company from greedy capitalists to unwilling, ruthless protectors of terrible knowledge who have to do terrible things to keep a much bigger, incomprehensible horror from being released into the world. They weren't just covering up a crime, they were also enforcing a quarantine. There are many stories about strange creatures and lights in the sky that have no explanation in the history of the Appalachian region. It is a place with a lot of dark shadows and old secrets. The Midnight Church Slaughter is the ultimate Appalachian dark legend. It is the place where all of the region's fears of poverty, of being alone, of religious extremism, and of the wilderness itself being dangerous and alive came together in one terrifying event. The case is a perfect example of how people can be desperate and things that aren't people can affect them. The people of Hollow's End were pushed to the edge by their situation, which made them mentally ready to believe the promises of a charismatic leader and the whispers from the ground below them. Blackwood's words might not have had any effect if they weren't poor and scared. Without the being under the church, he wouldn't have been able to use his madness to make it happen. The town was destroyed because of the terrible combination of the two. The most important lesson from Hollow's End is that the worst things happen when people are hopeless, and a darkness has been waiting for an invitation. The minister only opened the door. The people in the church, in their desperation, chose to walk through it. Their story is a dark reminder that people can be persuaded to give away the one thing they still have: their souls. There are only a few signs of the silent tithing left in the real world today. The church is in ruins, the town is gone, the records are lost, and the people who saw what happened are dead. It looks like the secret was kept well, but maybe the proof was never meant to be found in historical records or on geological surveys. Maybe the real legacy of the event was left behind somewhere else. A few park rangers and hunters who go into the valley have reported a new thing happening in the last few years. They say that on cold, clear nights in late October, You can sometimes see a faint, pale green light pulsing deep in the woods below the ridge where the old church used to be. The man-made hill now covers the fissure. It is a soft, quiet light, like phosphorescence or foxfire, but it pulses slowly and steadily like a heartbeat. No one knows where this light comes from in nature. There is no scientific reason for this. It is just there, a silent, ghostly light in the middle of the Appalachian darkness. Even after more than 100 years of silence, this shows that something is still amiss under Hollow's End. It reminds us that even though the congregation is no longer in our world, they may still be there. They are just waiting, changed by the cold green light of their eternal underground church, where they will always be together. The last scary thought about the Hollow's End case is the idea of a cycle. If Reverend Blackwood was part of an older tradition and the entity he served is ancient, then the events of 1907 were probably not the first time the mountain took a tithe, and they won't be the last. We don't know much about the area's history before Europeans came. What other groups, what other cultures might have found this place and been taken in by it? What other crazy prophets or desperate chiefs have led their people to the throat as a gift? The valley's silence may have been there for a lot longer than 100 years. It could be the silence of millions of souls that have been absorbed over thousands of years. We are left with a timeline of unimaginable horror. The thing sleeps, wakes up, eats, and then sleeps again. It is currently dreaming under a hill that people built in a forgotten part of West Virginia. But the land isn't always the same. The fissure will eventually be revealed again because of erosion, earthquakes, and people getting involved. The throat will be shown to the world again, and when that happens, the whispers will start up again, looking for another flock in need and another charming shepherd to lead them. The story of the church massacre at midnight isn't over yet. It is just sleeping until the next cycle starts. The story of Hollow's End is not over. It is written in stone, and the last scary chapter has not yet been written. What you have heard is a story made up of broken records, haunted memories, and the last words of a woman who flew too close to a truth that was not allowed. The story of the Midnight Church Massacre has been carefully erased, and one by one, those who tried to find it have been silenced. This is how a real and scary part of history turns into a creepy, made-up story. The forces of secrecy, whether they are people or not, have done very well. This leaves you, the listener, with one last personal question. How much does this silence cost? We are taught to be afraid of stories about monsters and crazy people, but maybe the worst thing is the silence that lets them fade away. When we forget, we leave the door open for the same darkness to come back without us noticing. When you find yourself in a place of deep, unnatural silence again, stop and listen carefully. Is it a silence that doesn't have any sound? Or is it a silence that is full of something, like a presence that watches and waits? If you look in the history books, you'll see that Hollow's End never existed. But if you know how to listen, the quiet congregation is still having its midnight service, and the humming has never really stopped. The real truth about what happened in Hollow's End on that cold October night in 1907 may never be known. It may be buried under layers of corporate wrongdoing, fear that has been passed down through the generations, and a lot of dirt and rock. Reverend Alistair Blackwood, the Church of the True Word, and the 37 people who followed him have been pushed to the back of history. Their terrible fate is a secret that no official record will ever acknowledge. Dr. Evelyn Reed's search for the truth ended with her becoming part of the mystery, her voice lost in the predatory silence. There is only the land left, and a deep sense of fear that hangs over the valley like the Appalachian fog that never goes away. This is where our story ends, but the thing under the mountain is patient. It works on a time scale that is much bigger than our lives and memories. It goes to sleep, it has dreams, and it stays. History books may not talk about Hollow's End, but deep in the ground, in the heart of a dreaming mountain, 38 souls are still serving in silence and waiting for the day when the door to their church will open again.